Hello, I'm Freddy. I'm a Chinese working at a tech company outside China. This is the podcast where I tell the stories of Chinese tech companies and beyond, the history, the founders, the deals, from a perspective you don't usually hear in the West. Today we're talking about BYD, before the cars, before the global headlines, the batteries, the lawsuits, and the one sentence that reset the entire company. Now, for a lot of people outside China, BYD seemed to just appear out of nowhere. One minute it's a name in a headline about electric vehicles, and the next minute it's outselling everybody, fighting Tesla, building batteries, building buses, building plug-in hybrids, building, well, seemingly everything. But the thing I find fascinating about BYD, and the reason I wanted to do this episode, is that the car story is actually the second act. The first act is batteries. And before the batteries, there's Wang Chuanfu's childhood, a boy from rural Anhui, raised by a family with almost no money, who grew up with a deep, almost physical feel for cost. So today is BYD, before cars, how Wang Chuanfu built a battery company from a small rented factory in Shenzhen, and how, in January 2003, he made a decision that absolutely horrified his investors. Because at the end of this episode, he says one sentence: I am going to spend the rest of my life on making cars. And that single sentence resets the whole company. So let's start in 1966. Wang Chuanfu was born on February 15, 1966 in Wuwei County, Anhui Province, the seventh of 8 children of a village carpenter. Both his parents died while he was still a teenager. So the story starts really with loss and with money being tight in a way that is hard to romanticize. The obvious thing would have been for him to drop out of school and go to work, but his older siblings refused to let that happen, sacrificing whatever they had to keep him in school. And if every semester of your education depends on someone else scraping together 10 yuan, 20 yuan, whatever they can find, cost is not an accounting category. Cost is survival. In 1983, Wang got into the Central South Institute of Mining and Metallurgy in Changsha to study physical chemistry of metallurgy. And remember, this was just a few years after the Cultural Revolution had ended. College students in China were still rare. That institute would later become Central South University, one of China's top schools, and the alma mater of many leaders in China's new energy industry. By 1990, he had a master's from the General Research Institute for Non-Ferrous Metals in Beijing. He stayed on after graduation and rose fast. By 1992, at 26, he was the youngest division-level cadre at the institute. By the standards of his generation, he had made it. But he had been trained as an engineer and formed by scarcity, and that combination, engineering plus scarcity, becomes the whole BYD story. So we get to 1993, and this is the first real turn. The Research Institute wanted to commercialize technology, so it joined with Baotu Iron and Steel Group to set up a battery venture in Shenzhen. Wang, then 27, was sent south to help run it. And Shenzhen in 1993, you have to understand, was not just another Chinese city. It was the place where the future seemed to be arriving before the rest of the country was ready for it. Deals moved fast, factories appeared fast. People who were ambitious or restless or just a bit impatient, they felt at home there. And honestly, I'll probably do a whole episode just on Shenzhen at some point. It's the birthplace of so many Chinese tech giants, Tencent, Huawei, DJI, and many more. And Wang noticed mobile phones. The big, brick-like phones of that period. We're talking about devices that cost 10,000 yuan or more, at a time when annual incomes were often only a few hundred to 1,000 or 2,000 yuan, and the batteries were expensive too. A single phone needed multiple batteries, and one battery alone could run you over 1,000 yuan. So he looked at that and thought, okay, mobile phones are going to spread, batteries are going to matter. And then he saw the second thing. Japan was moving away from nickel-cadmium batteries. Japanese companies dominated that market, but they were shifting toward cleaner, more advanced battery technologies. In other words, they were leaving a segment behind. Wang saw opportunity. His bosses saw a trap. Their argument was simple. If the Japanese don't want this business anymore, why would we? If it were any good, they wouldn't be leaving. But Wang flipped that around. Japan isn't leaving because the business is bad, he said. Japan is leaving because it wants to move upmarket into higher-end battery technology. China was at a different stage. Wages were low, and workers needed jobs. The very thing that made this business unattractive to Japan, labor-intensive, low margin, was exactly what gave China an advantage. Now, whether you agree with every part of that argument or not, look at the shape of it. Developed countries move on. Latecomers don't have to copy them directly. They can take the discarded step, master it, and use it as a base for the next move. And that, in miniature, well, that later becomes the BYD playbook. The whole thing, really. Wang sent the proposal up. It was rejected. He tried again, rejected again. After the third time, he stopped trying to persuade his bosses. He resigned. So now it's 1994. Wang has left the system. He has an idea, but no money. Banks said no. Investment firms said no. The project looked too small. The payback looked too slow. And from the outside, it probably looked like a former state researcher trying to enter a low-end battery business that Japan was already abandoning. Not exactly an easy pitch. So Wang went to his cousin, Liu Xiangyang. Liu was 4 years older. He had also come out of the system, moved to Shenzhen, and made money in real estate and trading. And later, in an interview about why he invested in Wang, Liu said something very simple: "I understand him." That's it. The point wasn't just family loyalty. It was that both of them wanted to do something independent, something creative, something outside the safe path. Liu put in 2.5 million yuan, and that number really matters. BYD's registered capital was 4.5 million yuan, so Liu's money was more than half the company. This wasn't pocket money for a cousin, this was a founding level bet. On November 18, 1994, Wang rented an 800 square meter factory in Buji Town, Shenzhen. He pulled together a team of about 20 people, and on February 10, 1995, BYD was officially registered. 20 people, a small rented factory, 4.5 million yuan of registered capital. That's where the company starts. And what I love about this is that there's no magic at the beginning, no giant state subsidy, no glamorous Silicon Valley-style launch, no shiny consumer brand. Just Wang, his cousin's money, and a battery business Japan was leaving behind. Now the obvious problem was, how does a tiny Chinese battery factory compete with Japanese manufacturers? Because Japanese battery production ran on expensive automated lines, capital-heavy, high-precision, high-volume, a lot of engineering behind them. BYD couldn't buy its way into that game. It just didn't have the money. So Wang changed the game. Instead of trying to match Japanese automation, he broke the production line into smaller steps. Then he used workers, simple tools, and fixtures meaning devices that hold parts in the right position, to reproduce some of the precision that machines normally provide. And look, it sounds crude when you say it quickly, people instead of machines, manual work instead of full automation. But the clever part wasn't simply use cheap labor. The clever part was designing the process so that labor could be consistent. Machines were expensive, workers were cheap. Fixtures were cheap, and if quality could be made good enough, then BYD's cost structure would be completely different from Japan's. This is one of those moments where you see Wang's method very clearly. He doesn't ask, how do I copy the leader? He asks, what's the expensive part of the leader's system, and can I replace it with something that fits China's cost structure? Then came 1997, the Asian financial crisis. Japanese battery companies cut prices. They were trying to protect their market, and in theory that should have crushed small Chinese producers. But BYD's costs were already so low that the Japanese couldn't push prices down far enough to kill it. So BYD didn't just survive the crisis, it expanded through it. And that's when the story moves from survival to credibility. Because beating smaller competitors is one thing. Getting into the supply chain of a global mobile phone giant is a completely different level. So by 2000, BYD wanted to become the supplier of Motorola. And Motorola at the time was one of the great global mobile phone companies. Its battery supply chain was dominated by Japanese firms. BYD was nobody. And BYD sent its salespeople to the United States, to Atlanta, to knock on Motorola's door. You can imagine how that pitch sounded. Here's this Chinese battery company saying, yes, we can supply you. And Motorola asks, okay, what kind of production line do you have? And BYD says, well, it's semi-automatic. We use a lot of workers. We use fixtures. We control the process manually. I mean, if you're sitting on Motorola's side of the table, that does not immediately sound reassuring. Their worry was simple. Human hands make mistakes. One wrong operation, one bad batch, one quality problem, and suddenly you've got batteries failing inside mobile phones all over the world. So BYD made three arguments. first, the process wasn't random. The fixtures created consistency. Second, quality control was improving. And third, and this was the big one, BYD's price was far lower than the Japanese suppliers. And in fairness to Motorola, they also had their own strategic reason to listen. They didn't want a few Japanese battery companies to have too much power in their supply chain. A credible Chinese supplier could be useful. So Motorola came to Shenzhen. The verdict wasn't, "This is world class." Not yet. The verdict was more like, "There's something here, and maybe it can be reshaped." And then Motorola did something that turned out to be absolutely crucial for BYD. It gave BYD its quality management system. Six Sigma. Basically the rule book that drills variation out of every step on a production line. The thing that was actually invented inside Motorola in the first place. Motorola sent 6 quality experts to BYD, and they stayed for half a year. Wang Chuanfu ordered middle management to study the system. Training levels were tied to promotion. Slowly, the whole operation got rebuilt around Motorola's standards. Now that sounds dry. Quality manuals, process control, 6 Sigma. But in business stories, this is often where the real transformation actually happens, not in the dramatic speech, in the boring system. BYD went in as a cheap supplier with potential. It came out with the beginnings of a modern manufacturing discipline. On September 22, 2000, BYD passed Motorola's certification. By early 2001, it was supplying Motorola at scale. And that made BYD the first Chinese battery company to enter the supply chain of a top-tier global mobile phone brand, which was a huge, huge step. The next target was Nokia. In December 2000, Nokia visited BYD's factory and had the same first reaction Motorola had. Too much manual work, too little that looked modern. Nokia took 20 battery samples back to Europe themselves, so BYD couldn't swap anything later. The results came back at around 1,000 charge cycles. Japanese suppliers were usually around 300 to 400. That got BYD into Nokia's certification process, but Wang's team still didn't understand the process well enough. So during the 2001 Lunar New Year holiday, Wang flew to Finland with 2 colleagues and got a 1-hour meeting at Nokia headquarters. 1 hour was not enough. So Wang found out there was a Chinese restaurant near the Nokia campus. He went there and waited, taking his chance that a Chinese employee in Finland during Lunar New Year might come in for dinner after work. The employee did. Wang got his second conversation. In May 2002, BYD received its first Nokia order and became Nokia's first Chinese lithium battery supplier. By 2002, BYD was already the world's 3rd largest battery supplier, behind only Sanyo and Sony. In 1995, it had 20 people in a rented factory. 7 years later, it was 3rd in the world. On July 31, 2002, BYD listed on the Hong Kong main board. It raised 1.65 billion Hong Kong dollars. For a company that had started 7 years earlier in a rented factory with 20 people, that is a lot of money. And after the IPO, Wang Chuanfu started looking for the next high barrier industry. Now, most people assume the next target was cars. But actually, the first target was chips. Not chip design, chip manufacturing, wafer fabrication, the hard, capital-heavy, technically demanding part. And his logic was very familiar. High technical barrier, large market, very few Chinese companies capable of doing it. If BYD could acquire capability rather than build everything from zero, maybe it could enter the industry. He explored buying a US wafer fab. The talks went far enough that the deal seemed possible. Then American policy changed and the acquisition was blocked. And that was that. And this is one of those alternative history moments. If that acquisition had gone through, maybe BYD today would be remembered as a semiconductor story first. But it didn't happen. So Wang turned to the other idea that had been sitting in the background for years: cars. As early as 1996, the Guangdong provincial government had set up an electric vehicle coordination group, and BYD was invited because it was already known for batteries. In 1997, Wang put a lithium battery into an experimental car. By 2002, BYD was experimenting again with lithium-ion batteries in vehicles. So the more Wang studied it, the more convinced he became that new energy vehicles weren't just a product category. They were a way for China to leapfrog. His reasoning was, again, very practical. China didn't have much oil. If car ownership exploded, Energy security was going to become a problem. And in gasoline cars, especially engines and core components, Chinese companies were decades behind foreign brands. So if you follow the foreign brands into gasoline cars, you're always chasing. But if you shift to new energy, the game resets. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's the 1993 battery logic all over again. When the incumbent path is too mature, don't simply follow it. Find the path where the old leaders are less secure, where the cost structure is changing, where the latecomer has room to move. That was Wang's theory. But theory is one thing, building a car company is another. So in the second half of 2002, Wang Chuanfu started touring the auto industry. He visited mold factories, design institutes, engine plants, assembly plants. He wanted to understand what a car company actually had to do itself and what could be outsourced. And he came away with a conclusion that sounds almost arrogant, but is really more revealing than arrogant. He decided that making cars wasn't as mysterious as people thought. Modern auto manufacturing had become modular. Design work could be outsourced. Equipment suppliers could provide production lines. Domestic institutes could help with standard engineering. The automaker's job was to control cost, quality, and a few critical engineering decisions. In Wang's own formulation, the essence of manufacturing came down to two things, cost and quality. And those were exactly the two things BYD had been practicing in batteries since 1995. So the strategic question became very practical. How does a battery company get permission to build cars? At the time, China's auto industry had licensing controls. A new entrant couldn't just wake up one morning and start making cars. The faster route was to buy an existing car maker. The target was Qinchuan Automobile in Xi'an. It was small, it was struggling, it had low equipment utilization and debts, but it had what BYD needed, an auto manufacturing license. On January 22, 2003, BYD signed the deal. It paid 269.5 million yuan for 77% of Qinchuan Automobile. The signing itself was not glamorous. A meeting room, a banner, a few people at a table, no great ceremony, but the consequences were immediate. On January 23, 2003, BYD announced the acquisition, and the phone started ringing, not with congratulations, with anger. Investors were furious. They had bought a battery company that was doing very, very well, a company that had just listed, that was taking share, that was entering global supply chains. And now Wang Chuanfu was telling them, actually, we're going into cars. To many investors, this looked insane. The questions came fast. What does a battery company know about cars? Where's the talent? Where's the experience? Where is the synergy? Are you just saying batteries plus cars equals electric cars and hoping the market believes you? One fund manager in Hong Kong reportedly threatened to dump all of BYD's shares if the company didn't kill the car plan. And the numbers looked ugly. Qinchuan's 2002 profit was only 726,000 yuan. BYD's 77% share of that profit was about 560,000 yuan. Against a purchase price of 269.5 million yuan, that implies a price-to-earnings multiple of roughly 482 times. And just to put that in context, a normal listed company might trade at 15, 20, maybe 30 times earnings. 482 is not really a valuation, it's a leap of faith. I mean, you don't need to be a genius analyst to look at that and think, hold on, what are we doing here? Within 2 trading days, BYD's market value fell by about 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars. The stock dropped almost 30%, from around 18 Hong Kong dollars to around 12 Hong Kong dollars. So from the market's point of view, Wang Chuanfu had taken a battery champion and driven it straight into a wall. But Wang's answer wasn't a spreadsheet, it was one sentence. I am going to spend the rest of my life on making cars. That line says everything. This was not a side project. Wang was giving the rest of his life to cars. With that, BYD's first act ends, but the battery era still has one last fight. It began in 2002, just 50 days after BYD listed, when Sanyo sued in a U.S. court for $100 million and tried to block BYD's lithium battery exports to America. In July 2003, Sony sued in Tokyo. 2 Japanese battery giants, 2 countries, 1 Chinese challenger. BYD stumbled first in the Sanyo case, then countersued and attacked the patent itself. By February 2005, Sanyo wanted to settle. Sony was harder. Its patent had already survived challenges from Japanese companies like Yuasa, Shin-Kobe Electric, and Hitachi Maxell. BYD's lawyers looked for proof that the idea had been sold before Sony's patent was granted. They found it in a Hong Kong invoice. On January 25, 2005, the Japan Patent Office invalidated Sony's patent. On November 7, 2005, the IP High Court upheld the ruling, and Sony withdrew its claims a month later. That deserves a beat. BYD became the first Chinese company to win an overseas patent invalidation case against a multinational. By 2007, BYD would become the world's largest battery manufacturer. But after the Qinchuan deal, the bigger question was no longer about batteries. It was whether BYD's method could survive cars. So let's pull the thread together. Wang Chuanfu starts as a rural Anhui kid who loses both parents young. He builds BYD by attacking cost, learning quality from Japan, and getting into Motorola and Nokia. By 2005, the company has listed in Hong Kong, moved into cars, survived investor panic, and beaten Sony in a Japanese patent fight. That's the method. Find the opening, cut cost, learn from the best, and move before the market catches up. Episode 2 asks whether that method can survive the car business. After January 2003, BYD is no longer just a battery company. It owns a car factory investors hate, and it has tied its future to an idea that still sounds crazy at the time. China should not chase gasoline cars forever. It should use batteries to jump to a different game. Looking back now, those choices look right. Wang saw the direction earlier than most people did. That's where we'll go next. We'll also get into the harder parts of the BYD story, the accusations, the controversies, and the uncomfortable questions that came with its rise. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. If you enjoyed the episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, and leave a comment with your take on the story or the company you want me to explore next. I'll see you in the next episode.
When I see you walking down the street with your funky style.